reason. We just ask that you do that through those doors in the back over there. That way we don't have, we can minimize disruption going up these stairs. So that's one quick thing. And then also just want to note that we'll be taking questions after this more structured, moderated portion of the panel. So if there are questions on your mind, definitely note them, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Awesome. With that, I want to go ahead and introduce our incredible panel here today. Andrew Jenks. Andrew has spent more than 30 years in the computer science industry, creating, incubating, and releasing new solutions to complex problems. Currently, he leads the Azure Media Security and is the director for Microsoft's media provenance investments across the company. He is honored to serve as the chair for the Coalition for Content Authenticity and Provenance and lead a cross-company team of experts in developing the next evolution of authentic media. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. We also have Dr. Scott Hale. Dr. Scott Hale is an associate professor and senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. His research seeks to see more equitable access to quality information and investigates the speed of information between speakers of different languages online, the role of bilingual internet users, collective action and mobilization, hate speech, and misinformation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hale, for joining us. And finally, last but not least, we have Arjun Ramani. Arjun Ramani is the Economist's global business and economics correspondent based in London. He covers themes across technology, finance, and economics with a focus on the social and economic impacts of emerging technologies. His most recent cover stories include Adventure Capitalism, Startup Finance Goes Global, and Mothering Invention. China and the West are in a race to foster innovation. Arjun also does academic work at Stanford University with Professor Nick Bloom, where he completed his undergraduate and master's degrees and was a Kennedy Prize winner for Best Thesis. Thank you so much, Arjun, for joining us. If we can give all the panelists So I want to start by thinking a little bit about how generative AI is contributing to existing issues that have captured the attention of the public and researchers and industry, like misinformation and harassment. So I want to address this question to anyone, and anyone can feel free to jump in. Based on your own work, your research, your reporting, can you talk to us a little bit about how concerning the rapid development of generative AI is with regard to misinformation and fake news? And in particular, how is generative AI reshaping these issues? What are the unique challenges posed by generative AI? If anyone wants to start us off.
Okay, I'll jump.
Awesome.
When I have this talk that I give again and again about why generative AI matters and why we care about provenance. My favorite slide of the entire talk is a picture of a shark jumping over a helicopter, which is super famous, right? It was the very first viral image to ever spread, and it was created in 2001 with Photoshop. And when that happened, Photoshop cost, I think it was about 20 grand. You had to have a hardware key for it. You had to have like this giant server machine to do it. It was really hard, right? What we've seen with the tools and developments in generative AI in the past 20 years, and realistically in the past 3 years, and in the past 6 months, is a change in accessibility and a change of scale. Now anybody can recreate photorealistic images on this laptop right here and get it to millions of users around the world almost instantaneously, right? And so when I think about the challenges presented by generative AI, they're not necessarily challenges presented by the technology itself, but it's the accessibility of the technology and the ability to spread the results of it.
And if I could just add, I think that's absolutely true, and kind of thinking from an economics perspective, right? The cost of producing information, critically realistic information that plausibly sounds, you could ask ChatGPT, rewrite this paragraph in the the style of Andrew, and it'll sound great. And in a sense, historically, this is kind of like what happened with the internet and social media, and that massively changed our news landscape, right? It allowed anyone to become a content creator. That kind of changed the kind of marketplace for news. We saw local newspapers get hollowed out all across the world. We saw this long tail of new media producers kind of emerge, and actually some media companies at the top who took advantage of this, like the Times and so forth, actually did better. So I think this might deepen those forces. They're not entirely new. They're kind of again kind of acting in a way to change kind of the economics of information foundation.
I think we're still waiting to see exactly what the consequences are. It's only been relatively recent that things like ChatGPT maybe have brought, that generative AI to pretty much anyone, right? Back to this point, you can make it on this laptop. And I think we don't yet know what the full consequences of that will be, but certainly as you drive the cost down to create these, it means that you can create more of it, certainly. You might be able to create more of it in targeted ways. So Dongwon Lee at Penn State has done a lot of thinking about sort of red teaming, this idea, what would you do if you were a malicious actor trying to make use of these things, say, for misinformation? The idea, one possibility is that you might try to be very targeted and so, I'm going to share this sort of misinformation, generate it with that person. In the past, I think we've seen misinformation strategies have also been just about creating confusion at times. Some of the strategies that have been linked back, say, to Russia and disinformation efforts seem to almost, around to the 2020 elections in the US, they seem to go both ways for multiple candidates, and it wasn't clearly like, oh, we're favoring that candidate, this candidate. It was more like, we're just creating division, we're creating divide, and I think we might see that the ability of generative AI is, you can start creating more of that, more confusion. Do I trust this or not? The obvious markers of what used to be, oh, this is clearly probably generated or fake because I can tell it's misspellings, it doesn't quite flow like a human. We were joking prior to the panel actually that now it's maybe the small mistakes that mean it's human, because of course the machines don't make those mistakes. So yeah, I think we're entering a new space. I don't think we fully know the consequences of that yet. Certainly there are many good things to come from generative AI as well, but I think we're learning about what the challenges will be in practice as it gets used.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's spot on. And on the topic of images that are starting to become, indistinguishable, it's hard to figure out whether computers created something, whether a human has created something. I'm curious, when these images start to become, as they have already, indistinguishable, or it's impossible for us to figure out, whether or not it's human or computer generated. What do you think that's going to mean for our information space? How do you think that's going to revolutionize our ability to communicate, given each of your backgrounds and your respective fields? Whether it's news or you're thinking about it from a corporate standpoint.
Well, I think one aspect is, platforms and so forth will develop ways to kind of verify information. So, well, maybe what Elon Musk wants to do and verify every single person who gets on the platform, maybe, that'll be deepened. Moderators on Reddit will have to be more careful. I mean, Cassidy's doing really cool research trying to look at provenance with different information streams. So I think we're going to see, a response from platforms and information disseminators to try to verify content, to kind of label content with the chain of authorship or ownership that it came from. We already see people who are working on, watermarking ChatGPT. You're going to see responses from people who are trying to spread misinformation for how you get around that. It'll be an interesting battle to see how it merges. But yeah, it'll probably put a premium on kind of quality sources of information that people can, trust as a result.
I mean, the sort of plug for the Oxford Internet Institute where I'm based is that we're looking a lot at how technology intersects with society. What are those societal factors? And I think that's what we're going to necessarily have to see a shift in is how do we think about information and consuming information? Naively, right now we might say, well, maybe most content online is human generated, so I just go in, that's my default mindset. And if it's synthetically trying to watermark it and place labels on it, or with fact-checking efforts and third-party fact-checking programs will label things that we know have been fact-checked and found to be misleading or false. I wonder if we're going to be switching paradigms a little bit at some point, where you might assume that it's perhaps AI generated unless you can authenticate that it's human generated, back to the sort of provenance idea that both of my co-panelists know more about. I do. And I'm just thinking, maybe what does that mean for media literacy efforts? How do we think about the totality of where we're going? And maybe there are efforts of, does it think about how we verify who is who online or the content that has been generated. Certainly other countries have taken different approaches. So South Korea has a name policy and registrations, right? And I don't know if ideas like that will regain traction or not, using cryptographic keys to actually say, yes, this was generated by me, it would be interesting to think about the range of things that are not just technical responses, but also are societal ones.
Yeah, I think that's a real key, right? Like, first, let me plug Provenance, because Provenance is a big part of the thing, or the answer, and
this is great, because this is actually a question I was going to ask you.
Was
So
it?
please, yes, tell us about Provenance.
So,
if you wouldn't mind, define it for those folks who don't have a background in knowing what provenance is.
Yeah, so media provenance is this idea that there's broadly two ways that we can identify information, right? One is through this idea of detection. You hand a piece of media to some magic AI tool that you have, and it tells you if it's true or false, if it's authentic or it's synthetic. Turns out we thought we were going to be really good at that, and we're not so good at that. And as we have, by fits and starts, gotten better, the generative tools have gotten better even faster. And so 3 years ago, if I was up here, I would tell you that the best detectors we have are about 85% capable. And now I get to come up here and tell you the best detectors we have are about 60% capable. And that's not great. Yeah, it's flip a coin. And the worst part is that it gets you into this weird world of, it might tell you something's authentic that's synthetic, and it might tell you that something's synthetic that's authentic, and you get into this world of liar's dividend where you just don't know what's true or false anymore, and you have no basis for belief, no basis in belief of reality. But let's ignore that giant problem for a second and talk about provenance. Provenance is the other side of that, which is that if we can't detect if something's authentic or synthetic, what we can do is market and say, Andrew created this piece of content at this time, at this location, and cryptographically bind that to the content itself, so that when you see it on Twitter, you can say, yes, this says that it came from BBC, but oh look, it was created by Andrew. Or vice versa, BBC can mark their content, and when you see it on Twitter, you can actually be sure that came from them. And that's this really powerful concept, I hope, because it's what I've spent the last 3 years of my life working on. I started with a completely different point, and I've forgotten what that was now.
No, this is great.
Oh, right, I was going to build off of what you said. So technology is great, right? But technology isn't sufficient. You've got to have platform policies, you've got to consider government regulations, and you've really got to consider media literacy and education of the populace. And without all four of those coming together, I don't think any solution we can put forward is viable. Like, you really have to have an ecosystem solution to things like the rise of generative AI and misinformation.
I think that is so right, and I think that that's characteristic of so many emerging technology issues. Is it's not enough to have a technical solution, a technical fix, or it's not enough to just have a legal response. It's often you need a broad coalition of stakeholders coming together in different domains to think about the ways that it's affecting the population. So I think that is so right.
One thing I might jump in with, I guess when we talk about misinformation, so far in this panel, we've talked more about a deliberate sort of attempt to generate false or misleading content. And I guess one thing that generative AI also makes me think about is sort of inadvertent misinformation that, using whatever generative model, and it wasn't that I sought to introduce a falsehood there or spread some falsehood, it's just the model hallucinated it, right? And, that's sort of the challenge. I think so many times the models do get it right, but then they get it wrong on occasion, right? And it's not that we just have to sort of fact check other humans using this content, but it's also going, okay, is what the model's telling me actually correct or not? And the ability to interrogate that is a real challenge, right? The model doesn't even know its sources. It's looked over all this content, but it's sort of lost the origins of it. We're coming to it as a sort of black box afterwards. And the question is, maybe how do we think about, and are there ways maybe in the future for generative AI to keep more of its own provenance, its own understanding of where content is coming from, and also, how do we maybe help individuals using generative AI to, again, have that media literacy awareness that, a lot of what's being produced is going to be inference over, lots of other text that has been seen. The model itself has no idea about truth or facts. It just doesn't exist. All it's seen is a lot of text.
Yes, this idea that context really matters, right? When you're interpreting these results, 100%. Absolutely. To pivot a little bit, I want to ask, and we talked a little bit about provenance. Arjun, I want to talk a little bit about your background, because you're coming to us from a prominent news organization, The Economist. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about how news organizations are thinking about generative AI, and in particular, the potential opportunities and drawbacks for news reporting, business, communication more broadly.
Yeah, totally. So news organizations, some of them are already adopting this. For example, CNET, there's some articles online you can look up, but they have these daily updates on markets, and they're actually written by generative AI models. There's some controversy about the authorship of that. First, it was this went under the name of a journalist, but then people within the company kind of raised that as a potential red flag, and they started adding the AI to the authorship. Anyway, so that's one example. Is you can kind of do daily updates, things that are relatively cookie cutter, cut and dry updates on various topics using these types of models. It becomes trickier in terms of doing more complex stories, because models can't go out into the world and talk to the people yet. So maybe at some point they'll start scraping from all the different social media sites in real time. They can't yet analyze a bunch of different data sets and come up with original insights that haven't already been put together. So it's the sophistication of these models, and to your point earlier, is quite uncertain. I mean, one interesting study that I looked at recently, Google did an RCT of their engineers in terms of how much more productive engineers become when they're using generative AI tools as coding assistants. You can think of Copilot on GitHub if you're a coder. There's an analog that Google has internally that's actually better. And you get 6% more productive. So it's not that much yet. They make a lot of mistakes. You need to edit the recommendations the kind of assistant gives you. And we're even further behind that as a writer. So I've tried to incorporate this into my workflow to come up with funny two-word phrases for headers and different charts and stuff like that, or summarizing content to figure out how to cut words. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. But it will get better. How much better it'll get is uncertain. But yeah, so I think broadly newsrooms are going to be affected by automating some of these menial tasks. But in terms of whether it's going to revolutionize how writers work, writing workflows, that's more uncertain. The last thing I'll say is, how are newsrooms going to incorporate this? One thing we're thinking about right now is, do we want to have a policy internally of we don't use AI when we're writing to kind of make sure our readers are aware that everything that's coming from this trusted brand is going through the workflow, the process of journalists who are fact checking all their work and so forth. I mean, there are probably some portions where you want to use it. For example, when you're coming up with social media posts, maybe that's just a summary of an article that's already been written. So yeah, these are all challenges that we're thinking about. I'm sure all the other newsrooms are thinking about. Some of them are already incorporating it more than others. And the degree to which it penetrates is highly dependent on the sophistication, the quality of the underlying technology, and how far that gets is very uncertain. I mean, we could have a technical conversation about scaling laws and how much more you can improve a model's, ability based on how much bigger it gets, and how we don't really understand that really well right now. But yeah, that's kind of what it comes down to.
I'm curious, as a follow-up, news organizations have kind of been seen as in tension with a lot of platforms in the digital age, because there's this competition, advertising revenue, all of that. Considering a more pessimistic perspective, are news organizations worried about using, generative AI tools that might be produced by or created by these same actors, and that being another way for these actors to influence kind of the news creation and dissemination cycle? You have already platforms that have a lot of influence over the way that this is spread, right, on their platforms and reaching an audience. Is there any concern about, now you have technology companies that are also potentially influencing, what journalists are writing about, what issues are brought to their attention based off of, the AI that they're using, or what's being written? Is there any concern or perspective about that? Are you guys thinking about that at all?
That's a good question. I mean, this is a concern that we've written about with TikTok. If you don't know what data is going back to China, you don't know if they tweak the algorithm to ensure that content that's not very favorable to Xi Jinping is not promoted as much, and if that happened to Twitter or Facebook, that would obviously change the information environment that all of us are operating in. I mean, we hope that we're going have tons and tons of different streams of information on top of social media platforms. So I would hope that wouldn't affect journalists too much. But to your first point about competition from platforms and independent writers and so forth, certainly I think that's going to continue to change the news landscape. I think that goes back to the point I made at the very beginning about how the internet and social media affected kind of the marketplace for news, where it certainly compressed a lot of the middle of the distribution, but then certain newspapers, small plug for The Economist, we've done quite well in the last decade despite the kind of increased competition from platforms. And I think more competition is generally better. So I hope this will just force outlets to kind of elevate their quality when they're faced with more and more people who are participating.
So one of the things that we're worried about from Microsoft research side, and that we published a paper on from our chief science officer back in September, was not this idea that you're seeding an individual piece of information anymore, like something horrible about a candidate the night before the election. That's bad, right? But when you can produce that over and over again over a period of years, you can create fake histories and new events. And then I imagine going back and trying to research an article about what happened 5 years ago. What you find is this stream of misinformation, and how do you influence future events?
Yeah, that's tough. I guess kind of raises the bar for researchers as well.
Yeah.
And, verify what sources they're looking towards for historical research.
It reminds me that, fact-checking originated as an activity within news organizations, and that, the most trustworthy news organizations sought to distinguish themselves from competitors by having rigorous internal processes for fact-checking. And to some extent, we've had problems like this. Again, the scale might be different, but the idea that something fictitious gets put onto Wikipedia, it's seen by a journalist, incorporated into an article, and then gets a new citation to that article, which basically a circular reference, and then it feels like, it's always been there. There was something the BBC reported on the history of the toaster. Apparently had one of those went on for a number of years before this was uncovered. And so I think, at the same time, it might be an opportunity for media organizations, and it's great to hear that it's like The Economist are essentially wrestling with what's the role of generative AI in our news reporting. And I think there's an opportunity probably there to say, okay, how do we distinguish ourselves? And basically, say, okay, you don't know in some instances whether AI is being, we'll be very clear. This is how we use generative AI, this is where it influences, etc. I think there's an opportunity there.
To be clear, everything that goes through our pages is fact-checked by multiple people, and it's quite a process. It takes a while. So, yeah.
Of course, the ongoing challenge is as media faces steeper and steeper cuts to available funding, back to the sort of advertising models, etc.
Yes.
Obviously, there's probably fewer outlets that can do the very in-depth work.
Absolutely. And on the topic of fact-checking, Dr. Hale, I know that you have done a lot of research into fact-checking, and I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your work around how we can leverage community knowledge to detect misinformation and hateful content, especially when it affects specific groups.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, alongside my academic role, I also am director of research at MEDAM, a nonprofit in the US that builds tools for fact checkers, actually right across the globe. And so things I've been having a lot of ongoing conversations with fact checkers are right at the sort of coalface of dealing with misinfo. And I would say a few things, I guess, about that. First, I guess we've had generative AI for quite a while. In practice, a lot of fact-checking organizations haven't seen the extent to which maybe it was predicted to come to date. Right? We've seen a lot more of taking an image out of context and misrepresenting it, rather than generating a wholly synthetic image. But as costs continue to drop, now it's going to become more easy for that content to be developed. I think there's a lot of awareness and a lot of conversations within fact-checking right now about dealing with that. On the issue of, I guess, identification, one of the ways that we've approached this is also by combining sort of crowdsourced or community knowledge together with larger scale machine learning approaches. The idea that detectors can get some of it and you might flag interesting signals, but the ability to actually bring people together and say, oh, you have a question about content and you spotted something that you think might be dubious, feed that in to a fact-checking organization. See if others are feeding in similar sorts of content. And I think that's becoming a really valuable signal for fact-checking organizations, especially I think when you're moving to encrypted messaging apps, Line, WhatsApp, Viber, WeChat, or so, the ability to say, okay, this is what people are seeing, and they're sort of connecting with fact-checking organizations, connecting with their audience, has proven a really valuable source of data. I think it's also an opportunity again to provide that sort of who do I turn to when I have dubious information, or when I'm in a group and that crazy uncle of mine sends me something and you're like, that's totally false, but how do I reply, right? And sometimes being able to locate relevant content and be able to say, right, it's not quite exactly right. Here's what a reputable source is saying about that. And so we've been doing a lot of work thinking, how do you connect people together, connect fact-checking organizations with their audiences, and then how do we democratize that and have more organizations involved? Because often, if you think about where fact-checking organizations sit, they're looking at the most prevalent content, the stuff that's affecting the most number of people, mainstream platforms, in this country you'd say English, and yet you have many people who are consuming content in other languages, diaspora communities, and so really trying to also empower community organizations to be able to sort of step in and serve this sort of role for the local communities in other languages, on other platforms, and I think that's a big challenge as you sort of think about even how well AI works in other languages, through to how well platforms are paying attention, advertisers are paying attention in other languages. I think we want to really work towards solutions that are equitable, and we don't end up with, okay, we have pretty good content in this language or these few languages, and then it's kind of a Wild West for the rest. And so I think that's going to be a coming challenge for us.
I know it's on the platform level, but how well do you think, at least for in a limited setting, does community notes on Twitter kind of?
That was exactly going to be my follow-up question.
Yeah, I think it's a really innovative and an exciting direction. Some of the challenges, and to say David Wren and others have done studies that say crowds can generally get things right. You can get an ideologically balanced crowd of, say, workers on, Mechanical Turk or Prolific, etc. Their judgments in aggregate can often reflect professional fact checkers. The challenge with opt-in systems, like we see with community notes or Birdwatch as it used to be known, is that you don't get necessarily that ideological balance, right? Because not everyone is seeing that content. It's being shown to a subsection of the platform. Only that subsection responds, and therefore you don't have that sort of ideological balance that academic work has shown is very helpful in estimating expert opinions. Community Notes itself also has this limitation by design that it doesn't add a note until there's consensus across the political spectrum. And so again, if you're mostly seeing only from one side of the spectrum, even the few people who maybe come in and do see it from across the political views, they flag it, even if few people on both sides do, but the vast majority maybe on one or the other side doesn't. Often those notes aren't getting shown. And so I think there's basically a challenge for how do we think through volunteer opt-in systems. In some instances, maybe less political things, I think they can work very well. There's an organization in Taiwan from GovZero as well, whose name is escaping me. But I think they've done a very great, very good job of crowdsourcing community fact-checking, and there again, maybe it's, when we think about media literacy, places like Finland, Taiwan, that, there's sort of an understanding that there are other countries perhaps sending disinformation in their directions, and a sort of societal level awareness that we want to work together for that. And I think, that can be a really powerful source.
Absolutely. Just to briefly, last thing, follow up on provenance. So what's next for you in your research at Microsoft, the work that you're doing with provenance, and what do you think provenance could look like, in 2, 3, 5 years from now? What's kind of the strategy to get it from the ideation and development that you all are doing right now to potentially a tool that's helping us realize truth in a generated world?
My hope is that over the coming few years, we'll see an upswell in the usage of provenance, so that you will expect it from places like major news companies, well-intentioned authors, and just like you probably don't, please, I really hope you don't get your news from 4chan today. You will probably be more skeptical of media without provenance. We expect at Microsoft that it will move to becoming more of the default mode for media distribution over the coming years. I don't know if that's 3 or 10, but we do think that it's headed in that direction.
Very interesting. So as I was preparing for this panel a couple of days ago, I was talking to a friend, and she said, well, it's just futile to try and seek truth. I don't even know why we're trying anymore. I just, there's no such thing as truth in the future. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that sentiment? Because I was thinking about that as I walked to class. I thought, is it even worth, can we even aspire to truth in the 21st century? Mark Zuckerberg once famously said, privacy is dead, on the topic of privacy. So I'm curious, as we think about misinformation in a generated world, what do you say to, my friend who says, truth doesn't exist anymore, there is no truth?
Was there ever truth, objective, capital T truth in the past? I think every time there's like a new technological revolution that kind of changes the informational landscape, this fear usually arises. And you do get periods of, heightened misinformation and polarization. I mean, we talked about it again with the internet, but even before that with, television or radio or telegraph, or like when, the printing press was created and so forth. So I think, it's good that we're putting more scrutiny on, the quality of information. We're thinking deeply about trying to understand kind of the pathway through which an idea kind of disseminates through society through things like provenance and so forth, all these new technologies. But maybe I'm kind of I'm maybe on the more optimistic side of things that these types of conversations will help us develop ways to kind of respond, react, and get better at this. I mean, I actually think the information literacy point is like one of the best ones, because when I talk to younger people, like my younger cousins and so forth, they're very skeptical about things they see on the internet. They're more skeptical about my parents, much more skeptical than my parents actually. And so I think societies learn over time. and hopefully this, again, will raise the bar on what it means for information to be quality for news organizations with fact checking and labeling things and so forth, and we'll be better for it over a long period of time, right? There's these periods of disruption where bad things can happen, as we've seen in the last several years. But
yeah, I mean, I think we better hope that we can arrive at ways to find consensus, to understand nuance and context in information, because I think our democracies depend on that. It's very difficult to think about how a democratic state would be trying to represent and sort of act in the interest of its citizens if there's not even agreement on say what the challenges are, what the problems are. I think about some of the really big challenges that we're going to face, things like climate change, for instance. If we can't agree that climate change is real, that it's happening, right? That, it's human God, that we can't even move to address it, right? If we can't agree that it's a priority to be addressed. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I agree. I don't think there's, an oracle of truth, or probably hasn't ever been one. On the other hand, we need ways to have conversations and debates and ultimately arrive at consensus on how we want to move forward. And it doesn't have to be global consensus. Maybe for things like climate change it would help, but at least, regional, local consensus on issues. And so I think, the challenge we're going to have, but I think is overcome, we can overcome is to have that public dialogue in a way that, you can actually have true debates and get understandings of what society is looking for.
I totally agree. You've got to have a notion of shared facts among society, not just for democratic processes to continue, but for society itself to function, right?
Absolutely. Last question, and then I'm going to open it to the audience. So get your questions ready. We talked a lot today about the importance, and it was just brought up again, of information literacy and users educating themselves, learning to become critical consumers of the information that they're seeing online. What tangibly can we in the audience do today, as we leave this conference, to improve our information literacy? Are there resources you would point us to, practices that you would encourage us to adopt? Like what is that, what's a little mini toolkit of action items for us as we read that we can adopt ourselves, that we can share with friends? Or do you think that this is something that needs to happen at a structural level? Like, should it be on us to adopt this information literacy? Is this something that we need to be mandating in schools to be educating our students to have? How can we get to a more informationally literate society? And what are some tangible tips and tools that you recommend for all of us here today?
Yes, to all of them.
Everything.
But seriously, very concretely, the Content Authenticity Initiative has put together a K-12 program to increase media literacy for students. And we know from past programs like teaching people what the SSL lock icon meant, teaching kids, they went home and taught their parents. They went and taught their grandparents. You were more media literate in all likelihood than your parents and your grandparents, and one of the most concrete things you can do is help teach them and pass on what you already know and the skepticism that you already bring to topics like this to older generations who didn't grow up with the same set of problems that we're looking at today.
I guess naturally, given my work, I should put a plug in for sort of misinformation tip lines and, connecting with fact-checking organizations and, being aware of the work that they're doing and then as a potential source to help reason through things when there's doubts. But I guess maybe one thought I'd leave the panel, leave the audience with, is that I think many of us are not as good at media literacy as we think. And so many of us here are probably, okay, I understand media literacy is a problem, but not for me, right? I'm here, I'm in Oxford, this panel, discussing it. And And I think we all have things to learn. Still, I have a lot to learn still about media literacy. And you can see this in random controlled trials where you ask people to investigate claims. And people go about it in different ways. And what's really interesting is when you ask fact checkers to investigate these claims, for instance, they often move orthogonal to the source. So your website is such and such on this website authentic. Well, fact checker immediately goes, okay, what's the DNS registration? What are other reviews of this website? What do I know, right? Whereas the average person often looks at the website itself. Oh, what's the website reporting and this and that. And factors often move to what are people saying about the website or its provider. And so I think there's different ways to think about problems and just this idea. If you're always open to the fact that there's more to learn, I think that will be a useful mindset as things continue to develop, because as we talked about earlier, the pace of change is increasing. Even just the last 6 months for generative AI have caught me by surprise, despite knowing about and having used these models for a long time. And so I think just being aware that there's going to be more and things are going to change.
I have little to add from what my folks have said. The one thing from kind of a news perspective I'd say is a lot of times I think disagreement between people within society, when you think about whatever issues on the headlines, happens not so much because people believe like specific incorrect facts, but rather they have an incomplete picture of the overall situation, or they kind of their interpretation or the framing around something is spun in a certain direction. For example, I mean, just to pick on Fox News here, they do fact checking too, right? For the news section. So they're probably not going to report like objective facts incorrectly, but what might happen is certain things or certain context is omitted, or other different perspectives are not necessarily provided, or there's like a framing on top of the news that's maybe often, and whatever your political leanings are, most likely sources are going to do that based on whatever the kind of slant of that source is. And so maybe the advice, at least that I try to do when I'm kind of trying to understand an issue deeply when reporting is, just get the broad perspective, right? Try to make sure you've listened to, talked to different voices coming from different perspectives on the same issue, and maybe have less, be skeptical is something I try to do, but fail in a lot of cases, be skeptical in my own beliefs until I've really gone through that process. Even when you think you have gone through that process, you might not have gone through it enough. So,
Lots of words of wisdom, and I think the thread for me is just the power of reflection. So I think that is spot on. Okay, I'd love now to move to questions. Oh my goodness, so many hands. Wow. I'm glad that I left more time than I was hoping for questions.
Sure.
I think the very first hand I saw. So
You're going to start with me.
Start with you.
Oh, no. All right. What a treat. So I actually kind of like this information. And I think we probably don't give it enough due. When we do red team style work on, say, DALL-E or ChatGPT, people trying to adversarially work on it, what we think we're doing is critiquing the model. But when misinformation happens in the platforms that we're invested in, we don't think of it as red teaming the model. We think of it as red teaming the information. So, can we not think about this issue from the perspective, or how might we think about this issue from the perspective of misinformation itself is a way of revealing the inadequacies of the trust networks that we have produced or created. We think of them as being self-evident, but they're really just an organization of databases that have been A/B tested for someone's interest. Why we should think that they are necessarily good and the misinformation bad, rather than they are inadequate and the misinformation is revealing that, is something I would like to ask the panel.
We started with that. I have no idea where we're going to go. That is a great question.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for kicking us off. Yeah. I mean, I would respond that indeed, I think, misinformation does reveal a lot of challenges and probably thrives because of issues that we have in underlying issues, right? Of trust, of lack of local news sources, right? Where there's an information vacuum, of course, it's much easier to step in. Misinformation also plays on identity. It's performative. We know a lot of social media is performative. Your work shows that. And why do I forward something on, even if I might forward something even knowing it's misinformation, right? So the idea that even if we had 100% accurate detection and I knew that was false, that might not stop me from sending it, right? Because it just...
It might be a point of pride.
It might be a point of pride. It's performative. Of course, I need to send forward that on. It plays to my beliefs. It plays to my group. It shows that I'm in the in crowd for it. And so yeah. Anyway, I think your question quite provocatively points to the fact, of course, that we shouldn't treat just the symptom. And we need to think more holistically about underlying causes, the whole ecosystem to it. And so I don't have an answer, I guess, in fullness of how we do that, but I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's a bigger problem and we shouldn't focus on just the surface.
One thing I'd add is there's a really great chart from, I think, Matt Jenks, his co-authors at Stanford, on kind of how trends in polarization across countries have changed over time. And contrary to what I believed before reading this research, trends in affective polarization were actually going up since the early 1990s, well before the kind of modern informational environment, which points to these kind of deeper structural forces that are interacting with the informational environment right now. Namely, that's around when 80s, 90s, when inequality kind of hollowing out of middle-class jobs in a lot of Western democracies started kind of really showing forth. So yeah, no, I totally think there are lots of problems that need to be solved to solve this one portion of it.
Take it away.
In the back. Yes, the person who's raising their hand was very enthusiastic.
Thank you very much. I'm Ato, I'm a fourth year in computer science here. I have a question about, and maybe this is like slightly in response to the previous question as well. I think what maybe the misinformation has revealed is actually this underlying system that lies on the lower layer of the stack, which is a profit incentive. If you take social media as an attention-jacking mechanism, right, where the attention is equal to advertising dollars and henceforth currency, and every motivation of a company is to maximize profit incentivization. Now that's number one, and then where my question comes in is, I'd be curious to hear about, you guys mentioned democratization of these particular technologies. One, I'd like to sort of challenge that idea with Microsoft's sort of $29 billion valuation and investment into OpenAI. And OpenAI has not open sourced any of its models because they believe that these models are too dangerous to, for the rest of humanity to wield. I'd really love to sort of understand the discrepancy here of sort of, in one sense, we see the value in democratization, but on the other hand, OpenAI and Microsoft by extension are sort of saying, no, these models are too dangerous to let out into the world. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about the I guess, paradox of that.
It'd just be interesting getting as many questions as possible. We can do 1 or 2 people responding.
Sure. On advertising revenues, I think you're absolutely right. This creates reverse or at least misaligned incentives, and meta research itself has shown that well, both labeling a post with a third-party fact check, but simultaneously removing it from receiving algorithmic promotion substantially decreases the reach of that content. And yeah, I think we have a lot to learn on understanding how these things come together. It's oftentimes the emergent behavior of algorithms in socio-technical systems, right, is not at all transparent. And so even if the underlying sort of logic going into a model of just reinforcing otherwise popular content and bringing things that maybe are similar to others that you've liked in aggregate, that can create very, very poor outcomes. And so yeah, I think you're right that advertising revenue is a big part of that.
If I could just add, I think news organizations are responding. So if you look at the share of revenue for the Times, actually we've never really been that ad driven, but for a lot of the other major publications that come from advertising, subscriptions shifted like massively over the last 10 years from, or at the beginning of the kind of social media age towards subscriptions. So I think that shows at least an optimistic case kind of shifting away from attention to quality a little bit, though there's still lots of major issues there, and I don't think it's a resolved problem. On OpenAI and models being open source now, I've spoken actually with Sam Holman about this before, and I think the argument that he makes, which you can choose to buy or not, is that in order to create truly transformative AI that's beneficial for society, you need to make money. You need to put a lot of money into R&D, and in order to get money for R&D, you need to have a product that is monetizable. And so they're playing the long game, and they claim that they're a cap profit company. He has no equity actually in the for-profit portion of OpenAI. That they're capping the return, so it's kind of a pseudo corporation in that sense, right? It's kind of a cap for-profit house under a nonprofit. So they've kind of tried to create a structure that eliminates kind of the worst incentives that could happen if one company had the most powerful technology. But other companies have also already released their open source models. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter if they release theirs or not. Other companies are creating things that are quite similar in some ways. What do you think about it?
Yes, I agree.
When you have more content producers turn into AI, the proportion of total original content, or I guess original content to total content, is going to decrease over time. And this feels complicated for regions, especially that have less digitally published content today. What do you see as the implications for the future, especially considering that for first-time internet users, they tend to leapfrog technologies? So the likelihood of turning to AI first, rather than producing content and reading through multiple websites, learning the digital literacy of fact-checking across broad perspectives, that might not come intuitively. So how do you think about the implications for the future of that for future generations?
I think for me, what that gets to is this really nuanced understanding of the difference between trust and truth and transparency, right? And those are radically, related but different concepts. And I think the most important thing for those users that you speak of is transparency. Know what you're receiving, and know where it came from, whether it was produced by a person or produced by a machine.
But in terms of transparency today, if someone in Tanzania is inputting in prompts, how do they know the perspective of what they're getting back? It's largely westernized, not largely, but it's going to be skewed towards westernized content that's produced. So they might know that it's AI generated, but if you just have more of the data points coming from certain perspectives,
it's model bias, right? It's going to skew even worse. It's going to skew to Western European and U.S. and predominantly to the opinions of white men today, and that's something that we have to fundamentally fix in our models. It's not the answer that I want to be able to give you, but it's reality for where we are today.
And it's a good business opportunity for anyone who wants, right? I mean, I think we've seen homegrown social media platforms, for instance, gaining real traction in emerging markets that, understandably, thinking, well, yeah, I don't want to connect to such and such platform that's just a Western sort of, I just want to consider about it. My work, back in 2010 was even looking at people who were sort of unwittingly or a little less willingly bilingual online. They were seeking content in additional languages because they knew that the content in their native language, wasn't as expansive, available, et cetera. And so people are creative, and we'll see both perhaps in the AI space, companies being able to train models that are more useful, more, just better for emerging or for alternative different regions, and probably platforms that cater towards the specifics of different regions as well.
One last thing, if I could.
Please.
I do think it points to kind of the one underlying issue, which is it's a good opportunity for philanthropists and other donors to kind of try to build out better information ecosystems in developing countries, like funding really good news organizations with creative news.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. So yes, in the back. But I do want to know, sorry, right there with the lovely scarf. I do want to note, though, that we're going to have time to interact with all of these incredible speakers throughout the forum. So thank you all for your great questions, and keep them coming at a later time within reason.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really interesting discussion. I guess I'm interested in the way that you talk about skepticism as quite like a healthy response to this challenge. But kind of from my perspective and from some of my research with young people, skepticism, I think, can ultimately result in like alienation, apathy, and a lot of anxiety. And I guess this ideal of like informational literacy, of like consideration of provenance, that's like requires education, but like attention as like greater attention in like a real kind of ingrained daily sense of more attention paid to this. So it's just, I guess a question to the panel of like, how far do we need to think about these issues like adjacent to attention, and when we're looking at mitigating the risks of synthetic media, is how can we incorporate intention into this discussion?
This is hard.
Yeah.
No, it's a really good point. I'm not super familiar. That's really interesting. Maybe we should chat more afterwards about kind of in terms of cognitive development and learning at younger ages, whether imparting a skeptical mindset is healthy or not. At least, I mean, for adults, I feel like at least my operating views is kind of necessary, even if it's difficult, but maybe there are better ways to think about how to incorporate this into education system that don't have those types of side effects. But I don't have great thoughts on it.
I think we have to find ways to minimize the cognitive load, right? The easier we can make this and the more approachable we can make this, the less thought it will take, and it will just be something that you notice rather than you have to spend extra brain cycles on. That's a heck of a UX and UI challenge for those of you in the audience involved in that.
I think your question about is very well put. I was working with some psychologists at the end of last year. There's a review paper that came out of that basically said, look, amongst the psychology literature, there's sort of two traps that we fall into in this. It's either hypervigilance, I can't trust anything, there's sort of too much skepticism, or gullibility, just sort of wanting to believe it and jump in. And obviously, I don't have the answer to striking the right balance between the two, but I do think your question is spot on, and is a real challenge for us in how to design systems that get that balance right.
So lots more opportunities then, looking to the future in terms of work that needs to be done. Can we give our incredible panelists a round of applause? Well, thank you all so much for joining us for this panel. As you all know, looking at your itineraries, we have another two panels coming up. You'll be able to choose between one or the other. I believe that deepfakes, revenge porn, and the law is going to be down here. And that panel on art and synthetic media is going to be upstairs in the panel room up there. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all for sitting with us.